I don't believe in ghosts. I still don't. But I'm not sure how to explain some incidences. Years ago, when I was a fresh nurse, I had an elderly patient, Jenny, who lost both of her legs. She stayed in one of our wards for a few days, and she finally passed away one morning. So the room was cleaned and prepped so that another patient could come and use it. I was on night duty that night and booked a new patient in from surgery. He had an operation done on one of his legs due to an injury that he incurred at a construction site. At about 3 a.m, I heard his bed ticking away. He was fiddling with the bed remote, the type that you can elevate the bed's height and angles. It sounded like he had extended the height limit, so I walked into his room to check up on him. I didn't turn on the light, as the light from the hallway was enough to dimly light the room. I told him that he couldn't extend his bed anymore, and if his leg hurts, maybe I could administer some painkiller instead. He replied, "Sorry, there's an old woman with no legs under my bed trying to grab my legs. I want to raise the bed as high as I can so that she can't get me." I literally froze. Firstly, I was standing next to the bed, and I immediately thought of Jenny, the elderly patient who died earlier that day who lost both of her legs. It was too creepy. I just told him he's imagining things and just sped out of the room. I told my 2 other colleagues working with me that night, and they got chills too. When I worked at a burn unit as a nurse, there was this one particularly screwed up patient. He was an elderly man whose face was burnt beyond recognition, and his hands and feet had to have been amputated in the ER before he was transferred to the burn unit because of how badly they were burnt. He had deep gashes in his back, shoulders, and sides. He was castrated and penioctomied, and his perineum had been torn open. No idea who he was, where he'd come from, or what had happened. Nothing. Since we had no way to communicate with him, he mostly just lied in his bed with a bunch of IVs giving him painkillers and antibiotics and whatnot. One night, I heard groaning from his direction and went into his room to check up on him, since he had been generally totally quiet until now. When I pulled the curtain aside to see, I couldn't help it. I had to let out a gasp and came really close to screaming. He was sitting on the bed rocking back and forth, drooling and humming. I ran to get the other nurse, and when I got back together and tried to get him back to lie down, he started screaming in the most messed up voice I have ever heard, thrashing violently all over the place and banging his head against the wall. He spent 2 more weeks in the burn unit before being transferred somewhere else, but I never really found out where, even though I tried asking around. It was all really ominous, if I'm honest, and I know it's cliché, but I can still hear his screams. They just sounded so messed up, like a mix of a whistling kettle, the gargling of a clogged toilet, and a puppy being beaten. The weirdest part is that it sounded like he was trying to say something, but I couldn't understand what. They were clearly words, though. Though I've never worked in the medical field myself, I had a childhood friend whose mother worked at a particularly notorious hospital for the criminally insane in the UK. She was a nurse on the women's ward, typically, though they had times where they were short-staffed, and she'd tell us about meeting some of the most famous criminals on the higher security men's ward. It was a demanding job. Once or twice she came home with a black eye from a patient, and in an unusually bad incident, a broken arm. All the same, she was a very kind person and saw the best in people, understanding that mental illness wasn't a choice and these people were suffering. The stories she told me were also about the building itself. It's an old stone building, full of traumatic memories for hundreds of people. Ghosts were an accepted part of the lives of the nurses there. They saw shadows and blurred figures moving past doors and windows. They had things moved and watched heavy metal doors that they themselves struggled to use be slammed shut by what looked like nothing. The patients saw things too. Some of them saw things that made them happy, others very upset. The people there weren't living happy or full lives, and sometimes they would have patients attempt suicide. They typically were able to prevent it, but sometimes they weren't so lucky. One night, my friend's mother was on duty in one of the lower security wards making her rounds when she saw a woman with short blonde hair sitting on the windowsill of a wide open window. Not something one would typically see in a place like this, staring down at the ground below. They were quite a few floors up, and she was sure this woman was a patient, as she was still wearing her pajamas. Not wanting to escalate the situation or scare the woman into jumping, she approached slowly and was beside the woman before she spoke, asking what she was doing out of bed and at the window. The woman didn't react to my friend's mum whatsoever. She kept staring down out of the window, so she leant out to see what the woman was looking at. On the concrete below, she could just make out a body, with short pale hair, hollowed around the head. She looked back at the woman, but she was gone. She hadn't felt her move, and she was right beside her, and she seemed as flesh and blood as anyone else. The person did in fact turn out to be the woman with short blonde hair, who was in critical condition, and later sadly died after jumping. And my friend's mum was completely convinced that the woman they identified and the woman that she'd seen looking at the body were the same person. She would also tell us about a man who hung out in the staff-only area, who the nurses called Bill, and who had a tendency to flirt with the nurses. They'd have their hair pulled and skirts tugged, but they never felt threatened. Sometimes their drinks and food would be moved or the doors would rattle, but even then, they'd just tell him to quieten down and stop looking for attention and it would stop. No one had ever seen a full apparition apparently. They just sort of all felt it was an older man. The most anyone saw in there was a shadow darting around, and orbs of what I distinctly remember her calling pale air, moving past people's faces and startling them. I was quite young when she told us this stuff, probably too young for the scarier stories, only 8 or 9. I just remember the story about the jumping woman, and the repetitive nature of Bill's behaviour always fascinated me at the time. My mother is a nurse in a nursing home. She has seen some odd things. My mother was working second shift, which is 3 to 11 p.m. So when she got to work that afternoon, and the nurses were having their meetings, she was told that one resident was dying slowly. They started having trouble with their breathing earlier in the day, and it took that person over 12 hours to die. The last sentence sounds very rude and callous, but it's the truth. The residents struggled to breathe for many hours. I don't know anything about them being on oxygen or any of the specifics. I just know it was a very long and painful death. My mum was this person's nurse for the night, and the resident passed away while my mum was on duty. She said that when he died, the pictures on the wall rattled and shook violently. My mother didn't really believe in the paranormal, but she sweared it happened and had no explanation for it. A case that was nationalised here in Norway was that of an African immigrant that was hit in the head, which resulted in him falling to the ground and convulsing and bleeding. His friends and family called the EMT, and when they arrived, they immediately believed him to be a drug addict overdosing. They tried to pick him up, but he unintentionally relieved himself, as he wasn't able to talk or was incoherent whilst trying to talk. The EMT called him a pig and said to leave him there to convulse, and they decided to drive away without taking him. Later on, the victim's family got him to the ER, where he had internal brain bleeding and needed to be operated. He ended up going into a coma for 3 to 4 days, but was able to recover without any serious damage. The notion that the EMT deliberately decided to leave behind a severe condition patient that they themselves said had possible cerebral damage from the fall to the ground just because he involuntarily had his bladder emptied is a sign of how the field is not about helping individuals anymore, but rather about profit, at least where I come from. We have a tall bridge in town that's notoriously difficult to bike down without ending up going faster than the cars on it when you hit the bottom. I was working in the ER one night when we received a radio report from emergency services that they were bringing in a 5-year-old who fell victim to speed wobble on the way down. He slid 10 feet on his chest and face, wearing nothing but board shorts, as he was about to go swimming. Before we could reply and tell them to take him to a hospital up the road with a pediatric emergency department, they were in the ambulance bay. We were thinking the worst. Everyone knew how steep that bridge was, and we all knew how bad it was in a car, let alone on the bike. So we get the room ready with scrubs, brushes and rags, ready to scrub the road grime out of his body, while everyone started discussing how we were going to sedate this most likely screaming child. This kid was red and bloodied, but it wasn't that deep. This kid was the luckiest patient of the day. Half his chest was burnt off, but there wasn't any dirt stuck in it. We just had to get rags with antibacterial soap to gently rub off the little bits of dirt around the edges and smear him in polysporin and wrap him up like a mummy. We sent that lucky little kid home with a popsicle and a prescription for pain medication. He was told to wear freshly washed shirts, changed at lunch, and to soak in a tub of hot water and antibiotic soap to keep the 1 x 3 foot scab on his chest and the 4 silver dollar sized holes in his backs soft. A couple of years ago, I was working in the trauma ICU when we had a suicide attempt gunshot to the head come in. The guy's head was wrapped up to his neck in ace wraps, and they took him to surgery just to change the dressing once before talking to his mother. The story was that he took a shotgun, walked far into a local field and shot himself. He went under the chin and completely missed his brain, just shot his face off. He crawled through the field until someone found him on the side of the road, which must have looked like something out of The Walking Dead. His CT scan looked like an outlandish Star Wars alien. He was treated at the scene, and his mother decided to withhold PEG tube placement to feed him or any reconstructive surgery. The surgery process would have taken years and been incredibly painful, and she said he had been unhappy and depressed for so long, and he wanted to end his life. That guy was on the most pain and sedative medications that I had ever seen in a patient. He was on 2 different sedatives at extremely high doses, one of which I haven't seen since. An incredibly powerful pain medication and paralyzing agent, because he would wake up, thrash around and hurt himself. His ear canals were destroyed, so he was deaf-blind and dumb, and he was still breathing on an oxygen collar, with no ventilator support. It took him 2 or so months to die. It was awful. He was basically starved to death on medication. The smell was terrible too, because they didn't change his bandages for the fear that he would bleed out, so he just smelled like a rotting tampon. His mother stayed with him until he died, slept in the room and everything. One of the worst cases that I've ever taken care of. I spent a lot of time as a child in the Vancouver Children's Hospital because of some serious, very, very serious asthma problems. I remember doing cheesy blow tests and endless needles, and awesome hot chocolate, but that isn't what I'm talking about. One day, I was especially bad, and as a kid, I didn't really think that I could die. I was just waiting to be better like everyone else there. I'm laying in bed, staring at the black CRT monitor that I play Mario Kart on, when my head stiffens, and I start staring straight at the door. I couldn't move, and a part of me didn't want to. Something was going to happen, and I had to see it. Now this is where I'm blurred. It must have been in my head, a dream of sorts, perhaps sleep paralysis, but it was so real. I also learned that the scariest movies, demons shouldn't be subtle and lurk in the shadows, for they are much, much more terrifying when they are obvious. The doors fly open, and the sickest, thinnest, most hunched black monster scuffs its head into my room, taller than the doorframe, but hunched over to fit through. A long black torso and smaller legs, and a face with 2 spotless white eyes covering most of it. It threw the door to my room open like an angry patient, and screamed at me to fall asleep, getting louder and more angered with each repetition, until it was stomping and rattling the door. It was begging me. It slammed the door, and immediately after a handful of nurses burst in, and I went into anaphylactic shock. Probably just a dream, but even now I'm terrified that my door will fly open and I'll get screeched at by some sick hellspawn. I came across this during my residency. I had been working triage in a Boston ER. A woman came in pushed in a wheelchair by whom I'm assuming was her boyfriend. She filled out her triage sheet, and for occupation she put striper. This should have been my first clue. She was complaining of abdominal cramps, nausea, and a high fever. We proceeded to X-ray, only to find possibly hundreds of shards of glass in her uterus. Upon further investigation, I find out the woman is a stripper, not striper, and one of her tricks is to stack shot glasses, squat over them, and make them disappear. Unfortunately, 13 shot glasses shattering inside her was not part of the plan. She had the shards removed, and a few days later, upon reading her follow-up care instructions, I told her to abstain from sex, and she immediately became angry at me and demanded that she wanted to be allowed to have sex with her boyfriend. Lady, you just had extremely invasive surgery in your tender lady parts after shattering glass in your woman hole baby maker. Why would you want to do that? A few weeks later, I was at a grad party with a bunch of other people that had been doing residency, and some of the other nurses and doctors. I told the story of this unfortunate young lady, and a few other people spoke up. Apparently this woman had been to numerous area hospitals with the same damn problem. Some people. I dropped out of school when I was 15. The academic life wasn't for me. That's something I found out early on. But after a string of jobs that were all pretty crap, I ended up finding myself working security, specifically the night shift, because most of the time I got to read. Anyway, I'd worked a lot of places and generally was managed through an agency. That's when my contact, Jared, hits me up about this private hospital. They're paying nearly double the going rate, and I was the first to jump on it. I tell them that I want in, and Jared tells me that it might not be a good idea, and that the place is reputed haunted. Now I need to make something clear. I did not believe in the paranormal. I'd worked in loads of allegedly spooky places. Loads of places that were said to incur all kinds of activity. Never saw a thing. So of course, I was the first to sign up, with my badge of 100% skeptic glowing the whole way. The first night, in fact the first week, went by pretty well. The job itself was pretty easy. The part that I was supposed to secure was the basement, which had the morgue at the back. Great. Super easy. Barely an inconvenience. The most I had to do was walk around and make sure that nothing unusual was going on, I suppose. By far, the best paid and easiest gig I'd ever had in my whole life. As you can imagine, it was indeed short-lived. Otherwise you wouldn't be listening about it now, would you? Nothing really happened until about a month in. I was just finishing one of my books when I heard something near the morgue entrance. It was very faint. I decided to ignore it, thinking that it was probably the wind. Then I realized there is no wind, it's the morgue. And when I heard it a few more times, I grabbed my flashlight, my walkie-talkie, and proceeded to investigate. The only thing I could hear were my footsteps and the faint echo of that sound off in the distance. I hurried and yelled out, "Is anyone down here?" as I scanned with my flashlight. No one was here. Just as I was making my way to where the sound was, it stopped. I looked all around, but couldn't find where the sound had come from. And so, I started walking back. I mean, what else would you do? When I was reaching my post, did I hear the sound start up again? Screw it, I thought. It was nearly time to do a full inspection anyway. So off I went. I started checking every single room, just clearing everything to ensure that nothing was amiss. And the sound persisted the whole time. When I was making my way to where the sound was coming from, it stopped again. This was starting to really piss me off. Someone was obviously down here and playing tricks on me. So, I decided to wait. I turned off my flashlight and hid in a corner, just to see if the sound would start up again, knowing full well that they were not going to get one out of me. And wait I did. The sound didn't come back. It's almost as if they knew I were there, which is fair enough. My shift ended at 7 a.m, and when my relief came, I asked him to do one final sweep with me. A few people had been down in that time, but I kept a log of everyone who had come in or out, and there was definitely someone in here who wasn't supposed to be. I just couldn't find them. We did a whole search, and nothing. That left me a little bit unsettled, but I tried to write it off and forget about it. Not 3 days later, going back to work, did something creepy happen again. This time though, I was just chilling playing a game on my phone when I hear something far more unsettling. It's a baby crying. It's not a particularly loud or obnoxious cry. It's a faint whisper of a cry, sort of like the baby was quite far away, but yet not screaming. I ran to the genesis of the sound, fully intent on finding the baby. I'm sure that a mistake had been committed somewhere. There's no way that a living child should be down here, let alone a baby. I was genuinely in panic mode, and as I searched the place, the sound could not be located. I was starting to get scared. Where was this baby? I was in the room where the sound was coming from, and it was loud, so deafeningly loud. But in this room there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was one of the storage rooms with still no purpose. It was all too much for me. I called someone up on the radio and asked them to come down, because this was far too freaky. I asked if we could swap for the evening, and they said they didn't mind. I just had to go and look after the upstairs. When they came down, I asked if they could hear something. They too could hear the baby cries. When we went back to the room, it was still going. We couldn't find where it was coming from. And he told me that the doctors sometimes like to play pranks and leave little speakers that make those kind of sounds in the area. So I started to piece two and two together and assumed it was that. They just turned it on and thought they'd scare the crap out of us, and we just couldn't find that speaker. We both laughed it off. I assumed that it was just that, went back to my station, and within about 3 minutes of the guy leaving did the sound stop, and I was relieved. I knew there was a logical explanation to it all, I thought, and was feeling very clever about myself. It was about 5 a.m. now, and I had just 1 more hour until I could finally go home and get some much-needed sleep. That's when I hear someone. This time, it's just footsteps. They're walking up the corridor. This meant that they were coming to sign in the logbook. So, instead of just sitting there looking bored, I get up to greet the person. I don't see them, and it's kind of at an angle. So I come out of my little hut thing, and I look around the corner. There are footsteps, but there's no one there. The thing is, though, if there was a speaker, the footsteps were gradually getting louder. It must have been very well done for it to be faked. So, I started going in that direction. There was no one. And just when I hit the place that I thought the footsteps would be treading at, did the sound vanish. Funny, I thought. I turned back round to go to the guard post, and there she was. A woman in all white, mid-20s, just staring at me. I just about crapped my pants and saw her walking away into the distance. I ran out of that basement and chatted with the other security guard to calm down for the next hour. When I was relieved, I made one last look downstairs to make sure that no one had come and gone in my absence, and no one had. I wasn't sure if I believed what I saw, but in the morning, when my agency opened up, I told them that I refused to work there again, and that they needed to find me somewhere else to work. It was by far the freakiest thing that has ever happened to me, and I have refused to work in any kind of hospital since then. This isn't just one incident, but a series of incidences. You see, I am a second shift worker at the local hospital. It is a small hospital, only 4 floors, and I've always disliked working on the 2nd and 4th floor of this place at night. Every time I'm on either one of those, I feel like I'm being watched. Here are some examples. On the 2nd floor, it is the same day surgery floor, and across that suite, there's the actual operating rooms. The back hall between the suites and the operating room are terrifying at night when security turns those lights off. One evening I was working that floor, and I was feeling watched all night long. I was trying to ignore it. In fact, I believe I was listening to this exact channel as I was working. I had taken some trash out of the rooms when suddenly my ponytail was flipped right up into my face, and it was like someone blew as hard as they could into my ear. I freaked out so badly, I had to pull my hair out of my face and looked around. I was up against the wall trying to see who was there, but it was just me. I even tried to do the same motion again to see maybe I had turned my head too fast, But even as I moved my head as fast as I could without hurting my neck, I couldn't do the movement again. I tried to ignore what happened and just kept cleaning, but the feeling never went away. Then last month, it was my weekend to make sure all the discharged hospital rooms were taken care of. On the 4th floor, there was the surgical recovery wing. No nurses like going down the hall ever, and when the lights are out and the doors are closed, it makes it even more terrifying. I was walking down the hall, heading over to clean the last room that was empty on that side, and there was no one on that side of the hospital, just me. The whole time, I felt terrified. I felt watched, and it was the same damn feeling I had on the 2nd floor. The energy was the exact same. I was cleaning as I had to get my linen to make the bed, and as I came back with my linen, I glanced over at the nurse's station, and there, standing up against the wall, I saw from the waist down a set of men's legs. It was the same energy, and I now went from terrified to angry, because whoever this is, he was messing with my work. Leave me alone. This isn't funny anymore. The legs stood there as I walked back, and when I looked back, they were gone. The feeling was gone, and I was able to finish my task. Ever since I yelled at the apparition, which I'm sure if anyone walking down the hall would have seen, I would have looked like a lunatic yelling at the wall. Then again, since then, I haven't felt the same feeling for a long time. I'm wondering if right now he's just amusing, and he's just waiting to catch me off guard again. My grandfather is 95 years old, and not long for this world. There is nothing but a mess of tubes and wires to tether him here with us. It's difficult for him to speak, but each rasping whisper carries a severe weight that cannot be interrupted. My family doesn't talk about things like death though, so whenever I visit with my dad, we tend to spend most of the time sitting in near silence. What a news week, huh? My dad might say. Grandfather will grunt. Crazy world. Then silence again. Small talk seems almost disrespectful to the gravity of the situation, but no one wants to be the first to broach the irrevocable goodbye. When the silence gets too loud, my dad will start to fidget with his phone or pull out a book until one of us makes an excuse to leave. That's how it went yesterday, with my father mumbling something about a dentist appointment and hurrying out the door almost as soon as we arrived. "You'll stay though, won't you?" my grandfather said when we were alone in the room together. "You'll listen to an old man's last secret." This was it then. The end of the road was in sight. "Would you like me to call Dad back?" I asked. Grandfather shook his head, as far as the oxygen tubes would allow him to turn. "I'd rather he didn't know." I already knew some of the story he told me. It began when my grandfather was 20 years old, living in Nazi Germany. He'd been working forced labor on a farm, but managed to smuggle my grandmother and infant father out of the country, hidden in a grain shipment. He'd been caught almost immediately, and sent to the concentration camp at Buchenwald, where he endured the next 2 years until he was liberated by Allied forces. "You don't have to tell me what happened there if you don't want to," I told him. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the gruesome details. He was unusually animated and persistent though, promising it was something that needed to be said. He wouldn't have survived the ordeal if it hadn't have been for a friend he'd met there, one of the Nazi officers. A Rottenführer squad leader had taken a special interest in him because of their striking similarity in age and appearance. The two would sit on either side of a barbed wire fence and swap stories about their childhoods. My grandfather would talk about my grandmother, how beautiful she was, and how he wouldn't give up until he found her again. The SS officer had come straight from Hitler Youth to the army and had never been intimate with a woman. He became entrapped in my grandfather's tales of romance, and the two became close friends despite the circumstances. The officer twice spared my grandfather's name from work assignments that meant certain death, and he'd often slip extra rations through the fence, which my grandfather would distribute to other prisoners. It wasn't a good life, but it was life, and that was good, grandfather said. Things changed as the war began drawing to a close. The Nazi officers became increasingly paranoid and desperate as the Allied forces moved in. It became common practice for lower-ranking officers to be held as scapegoats when impossible work orders were not met. Besides that, the rumor that the Rotten Führer was protecting my grandfather put him in a dire position with his own officers. Faced between protecting my own grandfather and his own hide, the Rotten Führer signed the order for my grandfather to be sent to a nearby armament factory. 18-hour workdays, starvation rations, and no medical attention. The factory might as well have been a death sentence. The 3-month survival rate was less than 50%. In the name of love, my grandfather pleaded to let him survive, to find her again. She was waiting for him in America. The Rotten Führer was moved, but his decision was final. His only compromise was to record the address of where she went and send her a letter to let her know what happened to him. So, how did you survive? I asked. Did he change his mind? Were you rescued from the factory? He went on to say that, shielded from the worst of the camp by the Rotten Führer, the transition to the factory proved too difficult for the young farmer, and he didn't last the first week. So I asked, "What do you mean, he didn't last? How did you get out?" The exertion of the long story was taking its toll on my grandfather. He coughed and wheezed, struggling to draw breath for several seconds before clearing his throat a final time. On April 11th, 1945, the Buchenwald camp was liberated. Many of the Nazis had already begun abandoning their positions and fled into the country. Others decided to lock themselves inside, pretending to be prisoners themselves so the Allied forces would have mercy on them. This was especially convincing for those who had taken the time to get to know the prisoners and could assume their identities. When the SS officer gave the information and address of his lost love, he was allowed to board the next transportation ship returning to America to be reunited with her. The gears in my head were turning, and then stopped. Your grandmother was suspicious at first when I met her, but she accepted that the war had changed me. Besides, I knew so many stories about her that she couldn't deny our shared history. I raised his boy as my own and lived the life he dreamed of every night until his death. Do you think your real grandfather would forgive me if he knew? I didn't have an answer for him then, and I didn't get another chance. He died in his sleep that night, after a long and happy life that wasn't his.